Hello students, this is the lesson video for lesson 4.06 and we're going to be going over chromosomes and genes. So here's a general overview of what we'll be going over today. We'll be focusing on the concept of chromosomes. You will know by the end of the lesson that chromosomes are made up of DNA as well as supporting proteins, and that chromosomes contain genes. The goals for the lesson is that you will be able to explain the relationship between chromosomes and genes, and that you'll be able to explain that genes control all aspects of cell life and are the vehicle by which genetic information is passed to the next generation. Okay, so let's start off with defining what genes are. And so the most simple definition of what a gene is that they are segments of the molecule DNA. So if DNA is the whole entire thing, then genes would be one part of it. You can see that here in the figure on the right, where we have DNA right here, all along right here, and one section right here is what we're going to call a gene. So DNA, remember, is the information storage molecule that contains all the instructions that are used by the cells to produce proteins. Remember, our goal is to produce proteins because that is what we use in order to accomplish different functions in the cell. Okay, so some functions that proteins accomplish in a cell are breaking down food, producing energy, regulating a cell's interaction with the environment and with other cells. And proteins also provide structure and building components for growing and dividing cells. And so DNA contains genes that make proteins that can do all of these things for our cells. So it's extremely important. Genes are part of chromosomes that are passed from parents to offspring during sexual reproduction and are considered the agents of heredity. Okay, so one important note, just to make sure you have an accurate view of genes, it's not, when we talk about genes, genes aren't always just one little segment of DNA. One gene can actually make up many segments of DNA and even DNA on different chromosomes. Okay, so part of a gene might be spread across different segments of chromosomes. But for the sake of this class, we're just going to think about it in a more simplified manner where a gene is just one part of a DNA molecule. Okay, so a genome is basically a collection of all the genes for an organism. So whether we're talking about bacteria or blue whales, all of them have DNA, all of them have genes that are necessary in order to carry out all the different functions of life. So DNA or genes themselves do not produce anything in the cell. They're just instructions, right? But those instructions are used in order to make proteins. Okay, so how exactly do we do that? We have this really important molecule called RNA, and that RNA molecule reads the code from the DNA and uses that information to build a protein. So essentially what we have here is we start with DNA, right? From DNA, we're going to produce our RNA, right? And we're going to use that RNA to actually make the proteins that we need in order to have a functioning cell. Okay, so again, DNA is our original instruction, and proteins is what we're going to use in order to do like the producing energy, providing structure, etc. in the cell. Scientists are actively researching the entire set of genes found in many organisms, especially organisms like humans, because that's really important in order to understand what keeps us alive, right? And also how diseases occur when things don't go as planned. And so scientists are trying to collect as many of the DNA sequences for each of the genes so that we can fully understand how a human body and how different organisms function. So how many genes do we actually have? So the exact number of genes in the human genome is still being determined because there are unknown genes and scientists are discovering them to this day. But so a lot of people thought it was around 30,000, but I guess now they revised that number and it's somewhere around 25,000 genes. But again, that's just an estimate. Okay, alleles. We talked about this in a previous lesson, but let's go ahead and review that. So genes occur in different forms or alleles. So basically, alleles are different versions of a gene. So if you remember when we studied about Mendel, we talked about his pea plants. And one characteristic that he studied was flower color. Okay, so the gene, we could call it like the flower color gene, had two different versions. It had the purple flower version and it also had the white flower version. Okay, so these different versions right here are what we're going to call alleles. They are different versions of the flower colored gene. Okay, and the same thing is true in our DNA. Remember, you always get one chromosome from your father, one chromosome from your mother, and they each give you a copy of each gene. So let's say this person right here could have gotten the allele for blue eyes from their dad, and then the allele for brown eyes from the mom. So you don't have to get the same allele from each parent, they can be different. Again, alleles are different versions of a gene. Okay, so genes are located on chromosomes in the cell's nucleus. Remember, when we have a cell, we have a protected control center right inside here, which we call the nucleus, and this is where DNA is going to be found. The DNA contains genes, which contain certain DNA sequences using the bases, right? DNA sequences, remember we use like adenine, cytosine, guanine, and thymine, right? All of these different nucleotides make up a DNA sequence that is different for every gene. The DNA in a cell is arranged into structures called chromosomes. Okay, so the DNA, we have DNA in our cell that belong to specific chromosomes. So an organism's genes are located on those chromosomes, and the genes for different characteristics are often found on different chromosomes. For example, your gene for eye color might be on one chromosome, but for your skin color, it could be on a different chromosome. All of an organism's cells contain the same chromosomes and therefore the same genes, so the same exact DNA. So for example, if we're looking at the cells that make up your heart and the cells that make up your bones, both of those have the same exact DNA in their cells. However, they make up two totally different things. Your heart and your bones are two totally different things. And the reason why that is so is because there are different genes that are actually activated. So we may have the same DNA in every single cell, but different genes in our chromosomes are activated depending on what type of cell it is. So a heart cell will have different genes activated than your bone cells. Each of your cells contain pairs of chromosomes. And the reason why you have pairs of chromosomes is because you get one from your mom and one from your dad. So for every single chromosome that you have, you're always going to have two copies, right? And we call those homologous chromosomes. You get one from your mom and one from your dad. So we always have pairs. So in a human cell, we have a total of 46 chromosomes, but they come in pairs. So we say that humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes. The first pairs of chromosomes are numbered 1 through 22. So you can see right here at this karyotype, we see 1 all the way to 22. The last pair of chromosomes are what we call the sex chromosome. It's what determines the sex of an individual, and those are labeled X and Y. Each chromosome carries the same genes from one person to the next, though different people may have different alleles. So every single human being generally has a pair for each chromosome that have the same exact genes. But obviously we don't all look the same, so we must have different alleles for those genes depending on what our parents gave us. So for example, chromosome 15 contains a gene for eye color, and this gene has two alleles. We have one for brown eyes and one for blue eyes. The brown allele is dominant to the blue, so a heterozygous individual, right? So we have brown eyes and he has a blue eye allele. This heterozygous individual, remember heterozygous meaning different alleles, right? Because he has one brown eye, one blue eye allele, will always have that dominant phenotype, which is brown eyes. Okay, remember when we talked about gametes, or we also call that sex cells, sperm cells and egg cells, they're the only cells in your body that only have 23 chromosomes. They only contain one chromosome of each pair. And the reason why is because during sexual reproduction, we're going to have a joining of two gametes, a joining of sperm and egg. And when you have those two gametes joining, then it's going to gain the total of 46 chromosomes or 23 pairs. So during much of the cell cycle, a chromosome actually exists as a single molecule of DNA wrapped around specialized proteins called histones. Okay, so chromosome, remember, it's really important that you know that chromosomes are made up of DNA as well as other proteins called histones. In this phase, chromosomes are somewhat stretched out so that the DNA sequences of the genes may be reached by cellular proteins that control gene expression. So if the DNA is exposed, then that means that we have these sequences that we can access and then make proteins from. But if they're closed up, then we can't do that. And so generally, in this phase, we have DNA more spread out, so it's able to be activated. When the cell is preparing to divide or replicate, however, the DNA replicates and begins to coil around itself around the histone. So it's becoming tighter and tighter, forming tightly compact coils. And when they condense, that's when we actually can see them, and we can actually actively see the structure of a chromosome. So you can see this here, DNA really spread out, right? But remember we said that DNA doesn't just stay spread out, but that they're actually wrapped around these histones. And these beads right here, right here, right here, these are called histones, and the DNA is actually wrapped around the histones. Okay, so that combination of DNA and histones is what we're going to call nucleosomes. We also have chromatin fiber, which are DNA strands with their nucleosomes themselves form a chromatin fiber. And then we have looped chromosome fibers, which is chromatin fiber loops along another protein molecule. And then you have your chromosome, which is what we see when we replicate our DNA. And so you see that tightly wound chromosome around all of the protein. So from this, you really only need to know DNA double helix, what histones are, and the fact that when it's tightly wound, we call them chromosomes. So let's go ahead and look into what histones are specifically. So a chromosome is made up of DNA and structural proteins. Remember, that's really important to know. Chromosomes have two parts, one DNA, two structural proteins. So if you were to stretch out your DNA in one of your cells, it would be about 2 meters in length, which is probably taller than you are if you think of 2-meter sticks stacked on one another. But if you really think about it, it's pretty fascinating that you have that much DNA when that DNA is able to fit into a nucleus that is extremely small. So how exactly does that happen? How that happens is by using histones. So histones are structural proteins that play an important role in helping to compact the DNA molecule so that it fits into the nucleus. So again, histones' role is to really condense the DNA so it can fit into that nucleus properly. Strands of DNA wrapped around histones produce structures that look like beads on a string. So you see right here, all of these little clumps right here are examples of DNA wrapped around histone proteins. And we usually call it like beads on a string. So just one key difference between eukaryotes and prokaryotic cells. In eukaryotes, we have chromosomes that are located in the cell's nucleus. And this is because eukaryotes actually have a nucleus and protect their DNA within there. But prokaryotes, who are organisms such as bacteria, lack a nucleus. So where exactly is their DNA? So a bacteria cell usually only contains one circular chromosome called a plasmid. So it just looks something simple like that. And because it doesn't have a nucleus, the chromosome simply fills the space inside the bacterial cell. So it'll just hang out within the cell. However, that doesn't mean that it doesn't make any proteins or doesn't go through a lot of the cellular processes that a eukaryotic cell does. It still is able to make proteins for the cell that directs many of its cellular processes. So we talked about how humans have 46 chromosomes, which means that they have 23 pairs in each cell, but that's not true for all organisms. Different species have different numbers of chromosomes, and many species actually have way more chromosomes than humans do. So for example, a camel has 70. So camel has 70 chromosomes, right? A guinea pig has 64, and a king crab has 208. So clearly, all of these have more chromosomes than a human does. So we know how many chromosomes each of them have, but how many pairs of chromosomes do each of these organisms have? And so the way you would figure that out is you would divide each of these by 2 to figure that out. Okay, and the reason why is because remember you always have 2 copies, one from mom and one from dad. And so a camel will then have 35 pairs, a guinea pig would have 32 pairs, and a king crab would have 104 pairs of chromosomes. On the smaller end of the scale, we have fruit flies that only have 8 chromosomes, right? Which is why it's used often in genetic studies because it's easy to manage only 8 chromosomes versus 208 chromosomes. And pea plants, like the ones Mendel studied, have 14 chromosomes. And a mosquito only has 6. So you see there's a great variety across different organisms. And here's just some more if you're interested in seeing how many chromosomes some of these organisms have. One important note is that just because an organism has more chromosomes, that doesn't necessarily mean it is more complex. Obviously, humans are the most complex organisms, and yet we only have 46 compared to maybe 200 in crayfish, 254 in shrimp. So that's really important for you to know. Number of chromosomes does not indicate complexity. Okay, and the last concept we're going to go over today is karyotypes. So karyotypes is a tool that geneticists use to help them identify chromosomal changes that might cause diseases or other conditions. Most notably, sometimes diseases will cause chromosomes to be missing. Sometimes there will be more than 2 chromosomes for certain diseases, and other times you can have chromosomes with missing parts, and all of these because DNA is so essential in allowing an organism to function properly. If there's missing DNA, if there's too too much DNA or if there's just missing segments of DNA, those all can really hinder a person's health and cause genetic disorders. So karyotype is really an ordered visual display of all of a person's chromosomes. We saw a real picture of it in the previous slide, but here you would see how they would have the same chromosomes right next to each other, and also the sex chromosomes as well. The chromosomes are numbered according to the karyotype, with chromosome 1 usually being the largest. Okay, so here's what we accomplished today. We talked about what a chromosome is. We defined what a gene was, right? We know that chromosomes contain genes, which is segments of DNA that code for really important proteins. And we also know structurally, chromosomes are made up of two things. One is DNA, and two, those supporting proteins, which we call histones. So here's some important vocabulary you should be reviewing. Remember, gene is that segment of DNA. DNA is all of the genetic information that an organism needs to live. Allele is a specific form or version of a gene. A chromosome is a single long molecule of DNA, right? So we have DNA, and it also contains proteins called histones. We know that histones are proteins found in association with chromosomes. And lastly, we went over karyotype, which is a photograph that displays the paired homologous chromosomes of an individual.